Guild Wars 2 came out almost a decade ago, and it is a game that has had a profound impact on my life. I've spent thousands of hours in Syria, and I met most of my best friends while playing the game. Today, I want to take a look back at the history of this game I love so much. From where it all began, a fledgling studio forging a brand new IP, to where we are now, with Guild Wars 2's End of Dragons expansion just a couple of months away. This is the history of Guild Wars 2. The story of Guild Wars starts all the way back in the spring of 2000. Mike O'Brien, Patrick Wyeth and Jeff Strain, three very prominent developers at Blizzard Entertainment, left Blizzard to found their own studio, ArenaNet. ArenaNet's first game was Guild Wars, an online multiplayer RPG. It released in April of 2005, only a couple of months after World of Warcraft. World of Warcraft was taking the gaming world by storm, quickly attracting an enormous amount of players. But while Guild Wars wasn't as much of a phenomenon as WoW, it did very well for itself. Guild Wars was very different from MMORPGs at the time. The game was not about grinding for gear to get stronger. Players could reach the level cap very quickly, and getting the best gear was not much work at all. In Guild Wars, victory would be determined by player skill, not by hours played. There was also no subscription fee required to play. You just bought the game in a store, activated your account, and that was it. You could play as much as you wanted to without having to pay for a subscription. This is what got 11-year-old me to choose Guild Wars over World of Warcraft, and I was definitely not the only one. But ArenaNet still had to make money somehow. They chose to do this by releasing new campaigns. These were a bit like expansions, with new content, professions and maps, but you could also play them standalone. ArenaNet started releasing these campaigns at an incredible pace. Factions came out a year after the original game, and Nightfall followed only 6 months later. Another thing that set Guild Wars apart from the big MMOs at the time was that its world wasn't fully persistent. It wasn't fully online. You would see players in cities and outposts, but once you set foot outside of those, it would just be you and your party. The explorable maps of the world were instances. As ArenaNet started work on the 4th campaign, Guild Wars Utopia, they started to experiment with their established formula. They created a prototype of a persistent map, where you did see other random players running around. The developers also had lots of other new ideas for Utopia, and it was becoming more and more difficult to add those to the existing Guild Wars 1. Eventually, ArenaNet decided to take their brand new ideas and move them to an entirely new game. That game, of course, was Guild Wars 2. In 2007, Guild Wars 2 was announced in an article in PC Gamer. Fans were promised something entirely new. Unlike Guild Wars 1, Guild Wars 2 would feature multiple playable races. The world would no longer be instant. You could now see other players, and player movements was greatly expanded. We got a pretty good idea of what the core ideas behind Guild Wars 2 were. Dynamic events were introduced, and so was World vs. World. To tide Guild Wars fans over, ArenaNet also announced a final expansion for Guild Wars 1. This was Eye of the North. But the real excitement was for the big new game. A beta had been announced for 2008, so it couldn't be that far away, right? At the time the article was published, ArenaNet had only just barely started working on Guild Wars 2. There were still many more long years of development left. The 2008 beta did not appear, and for the first couple years, ArenaNet developed the game mostly in silence. Guild Wars 2 sounded like this incredible game, but one thing was becoming clear: it was still many years away. The wait for Guild Wars 2 would last 5 years in total. Eventually, ArenaNet started telling us more and more about the game. Guild Wars 2 was going to be a big, persistent MMO, just like the enormously successful World of Warcraft, but it still retained much of ArenaNet's core philosophies. The game would once again require no subscription fee, and player skill would again be more important than grinding for gear. Guild Wars 2 started attracting the attention of other players in the MMO community. ArenaNet talks a lot about issues they saw with other big MMOs, and how Guild Wars 2 was going to solve those.
I swung a sword. I swung a sword again. Hey, I swung it again.
Guild Wars 2 would do away with the DPS, tank, healer, holy trinity, so that a group of players could just hop into a dungeon without having to wait for a healer to show up. There would also be no gear treadmill. Instead, good gear would still be good gear years after being acquired. Dynamic events replaced traditional questing to make the world feel more alive. Events would just be happening in the world, whether the players would be around to experience them or not. These ideas resonated with a lot of MMO players at the time, and the hype around Guild Wars 2 started getting bigger and bigger. Playable demos for Guild Wars 2 started showing up at several conventions around the world, and then finally, after a series of beta weekends, Guild Wars 2 released in August of 2012. Guild Wars 2 was received with near universal acclaim. On Metacritic, the game averaged a score of 9 out of 10, with one reviewer calling it the best online role-playing game in years. Sales were also looking really good. Before the game had come out, more than 1 million players had pre-ordered it, and 2 weeks after launch, the game surpassed 2 million in sales. At the time, it felt like everyone I knew was playing Guild Wars 2. My friends from high school, my online friends from other MMOs. In fact, there were so many players that the servers couldn't really handle as well. There were many issues with players not being able to get into the same map flows, and ArenaNet even halted sales at some point to increase server capacity. Guild Wars 2 looks like it was off to a pretty incredible start. I loved Guild Wars 2 at launch, and I had an absolute blast leveling my first characters to max level. Lots of my friends were playing too, and together we were discovering this brand new version of Tyria bit by bit. But eventually, I started to notice that a significant portion of my friends stopped playing the game. It's a common trend with MMOs nowadays. At launch, there is a gigantic rush of players, but once the hype has calmed down a bit, many players quit and move on to the next big thing. While we don't have any data on how many players were playing Guild Wars 2, that is what it felt like in those early days. Many players reached max level and then felt a little bit lost on what to do next. At max level, the main activities that were available to players were PvP, World vs World, and farming PvE for prestigious cosmetics. There was a set of dungeons and open world events, but compared to other existing MMOs that had been releasing content for years, there wasn't really all that much. There were no raids, so there was no big challenging raid boss waiting at the end to be taken down. Many players, including myself, fell in love with the game regardless, replaying the content there was over and over. But many others felt that, after reaching max level, getting the best gear, and experiencing every bit of content, there wasn't anything left for them to do. The phrase, "and Guild Wars 2 has no endgame," started to regularly appear on various gaming forums. Many of the initial players moved on from Guild Wars 2, but despite that, a healthy active player base stuck with the game. And it was very clear what they wanted: more content. It didn't take long for ArenaNet to start releasing regular updates for Guild Wars 2. Halloween and Winter's Day, two festivals fondly remembered from Guild Wars 1, made their way to the sequel shortly after launch. New mini-dungeons, jumping puzzles and even events were added. But the first major content release for Guild Wars 2 was The Lost Shores. The Lost Shores added a new map to the game for the very first time, Southern Cove, and ArenaNet decided to turn this into a special event. There was a one-time meta event where players were tasked with establishing a foothold and taking control of the island. This was a really cool concept. The map wasn't just dropped into the game in its final state. Players on the server had to capture it first. It was like being part of Guild Wars 2 history. Of course, a lot of players were excited to be a part of this one-time event. Probably a little bit too many players. The servers were struggling to keep up, and back then the game didn't have the player culling options that we have now. This meant that the huge concentrated crowd of players led to pretty abysmal frame rates. The Lost Shores also added another major piece of content to the game, the Fractals of the Mist. Fractals would let you place short dungeon paths in sets of 3, and players could progress to harder difficulty levels. To enter the higher fractal levels, a new gear tier was required: Ascended Gear. It felt like Fractals and Ascended Gear were designed to give PvE players more progression, to give them more goals to go for after reaching max level. After all, a common point of criticism at the time was that Guild Wars 2 had no endgame. Previously, the best gear tier in the game was Exotic, which was extremely easy to acquire. Ascended Gear gave players much more of a long-term goal to work towards after reaching the level cap. Ascended Gear was initially met with major backlash from a large part of the community. Lots of players were concerned that this new gear tier would mean a gear treadmill would be added to Guild Wars 2 after all, and that grinding for new gear tiers would become commonplace. ArenaNet responded that this was not their plan at all. There would be no stronger gear tiers added beyond Ascended. And to ArenaNet's credit, they kept true to that promise. Almost a decade later, Ascended gear is still the gear with the highest stats in the game, and players seem pretty okay with its existence. No gear treadmill was added, and exotic gear is still absolutely viable. It's just that if you really want to max out your stats, it will take a little bit more effort than just buying exotic gear on the trading post. Despite the technical issues with the Lost Shores meta events, ArenaNet pressed on with their vision of a constantly changing dynamic world, and they kicked off Living World Season 1. The idea was to make the game almost like a TV show, with new content releasing all the time, but only being available for a limited amount of time. You better tune into the game regularly, or you would miss some of this. The Living World kicked off with a thrilling premiere. You ran around fixing signposts. But after that, more interesting updates started releasing regularly. Sometimes the story would be told through open world events, but there was also instance content. Several dungeons were added, like the Molten Facility and the Everblade Retreats, but these dungeons only stayed in the game for a couple of weeks before being removed again. A true highlight of Living World Season 1 was the Super Adventure Box. The Super Adventure Box was released on April Fool's Day 2014. It is a special jumping puzzle activity with a retro platformer aesthetic. ArenaNet even made an old-school commercial for it with a somewhat disturbing real-life Riddle.
The fate of Tyrion is in your hands!
Most players loved the Super Adventure Box, but again, it was only temporary. Nowadays, Super Adventure Box is a festival and it comes around once a year. Despite much Living World Season 1 content being only temporary, there were also some permanent additions to the game. Twaddle, a pretty boring world boss before, was revamped and became a true challenge, with players struggling to get their first kill. The brand new Triple Trouble Worm boss was even more challenging, with many servers competing for the world's first kill. A new World vs World map was added, which players could access while queuing for the other maps. There were also new fractals, with several of these temporary dungeons making a return as fractal content. Living World Season 1 culminated with an attack on Lion's Arch, the biggest player hub in the game. During this event, Lion's Arch was transformed into a war zone. NPCs and essential services were relocated to the Vigil Keep in Gandharan Fields. That's right, for just a little while, the mostly unremarkable Vigil Keep was the player hub of Guild Wars 2. The attack on Lion's Arch is very fondly remembered by many players, but to this day there are still many in the community who miss the old original Lion's Arch. After the finale of Season 1, there was a bit of a gap before Season 2 kicks off. At this time, Guild Wars 2 had been out for almost 2 years and many people were hoping for an expansion announcement. They would have to wait a little bit longer. While there was no expansion on the horizon just yet, ArenaNet filled the gap between Seasons 1 and 2 with the release of a so-called feature pack. This feature pack update contained a ton of new features and quality of life improvements. Some big highlights were the wardrobe, which took Fashion Wars to the next level, and Mega Servers. Mega Servers effectively merged all Guild Wars 2 servers together, making the world feel more alive and active than ever before. Early leveling zones were now once again filled with plenty of players. But Mega Servers also took something away. In early Guild Wars 2, there was a certain sense of community on each server. I used to be on Far Shiver Peaks, and it felt like I knew all the big guilds on my server. When I walked into Lion's Arch, I felt like I knew half of the players there. Mega Servers took that sense of community away, but they did make the game feel much more active and alive. I never would have met many of the people I play Guild Wars 2 with today if it weren't for Mega Servers. After a couple of months, Season 2 of the Living Worlds finally started. Season 2 did away with the temporary nature of Season 1. Because Season 1 content would often get removed a couple of weeks after release, it meant that while ArenaNet had produced a ton of content, only a small part of it was still accessible. It also made getting back into the story after missing an episode kind of a jarring experience. So with Season 2, the story was told through replayable, permanently accessible story instances. 2 new maps were added, Drytop and the Silver Wastes, and new story would release every 2 weeks. Hold on a second, let me repeat that. Every 2 weeks. These releases were kinda small, but new story was releasing constantly. Maybe it was even a bit too fast. I very much recall many of my friends falling behind. Season 2 also had a mid-season break. During this break, another feature pack was released. A true expansion was still nowhere to be seen, but these feature packs were steadily improving the game. The trading post was entirely revamped and collection achievements were added. For collection achievements, players had to collect sets of items. In modern times, collections have kind of become the quest system of Guild Wars 2. If there's a big item to work towards with lots of steps, it's probably implemented as a collection. But perhaps the biggest change introduced by Feature Pack 2 was the new player experience. Alright, calm down everyone, it really wasn't that bad. The new player experience was designed to retain more of the new players trying out Guild Wars 2, and to make the leveling experience less overwhelming. There were now level up rewards, and there was a pointer on the screen pointing new players to potential stuff to do. Lots of features that were previously available to players from the beginning, like the downstate and weapon swapping, were now only introduced upon reaching a certain level. Many hearts in beginner zones were simplified, and you would now unlock more and more weapon skills as you levels. The new player experience was received somewhat badly by the existing Guild Wars 2 player base. Many players felt that these changes were unnecessary, and that resources should be spent on new content for veteran players instead. The fact that we still didn't know anything about a true expansion probably didn't help. I personally thought that the controversy was a bit overblown. While not every change hit the mark, it's important to remember that these changes were meant for new players, not for the veteran players who already knew the game inside out. Ever since this patch, ArenaNet hasn't changed much about the experience for new players. I think that's a shame, and I would love to see them try to improve the leveling experience further. After a couple of weeks, Season 2 continued and wrapped up with a spectacular finale. The finale finally gave the veteran player base what they wanted, a teaser for a Guild Wars 2 expansion. Heart of Thorns was announced, featuring lots of new features and lots of new maps to explore. The community excitement was off the charts, and the base game was also announced to be going free to play. However, we would have to wait quite a while before we could hop into Heart of Thorns. This was one of the longest content routes the game has ever seen. There was almost a year between the end of Season 2 and the release of Heart of Thorns. We were kept pretty busy with expansion news, betas, and the rebuilding of Lion's Arch, but this was still a long period of time without much new content to play. When Heart of Thorns finally came out, the community loved it, for the most part. Heart of Thorns added masteries, elite specializations, new maps, gliding, a new profession, guild halls, and more. Raids were added and fractals were revamped. The PvE endgame of Guild Wars 2 was really starting to get fleshed out. There was a new world vs world map and also a new PvP game mode called Strongholds. Strongholds unfortunately died pretty fast. But looking back, it is honestly impressive how many features were added by Heart of Thorns. Heart of Thorns was for the most part a huge success, and it really turned Guild Wars 2 into the game that it is today. Of course, there was also criticism of the expansion as well. Some players were disappointed by the number of maps in Heart of Thorns. While the maps were bigger and more vertical than ever before, there were only 4 of them, and one of them was a big event map which wasn't really meant to be explored alone. Heart of Thorns added a new area, but some people were hoping that an expansion would mean an entirely new continent, like back in the Guild Wars 1 days. Over the years, many people changed their opinion about this. While there were only 4 maps, the Heart of Thorns maps were very replayable, and many players still think that Heart of Thorns is the peak of Guild Wars 2 map and event design. Another common piece of criticism was that Heart of Thorns was too challenging. While some players loved the challenge, there were also more casual players who had trouble surviving and navigating the jungle. Eventually, the difficulty of Heart of Thorns was toned down significantly, but the Heart of Maguma is still considered by many to be the most challenging area in all of Guild Wars 2. After the release of Heart of Thorns, there was once again a long content drought. Depending on who you ask. For almost a year, the next Living World season was nowhere to be seen, but during this time, ArenaNet was releasing raid rings regularly. Heart of Thorns had made the PvE endgame of Guild Wars 2 much more interesting. Before, the most common and effective strategy to clear PvE content was to have a full glass cannon DPS party and kill the enemies before they killed you. With the introduction of elite specializations and raiding, raid groups were now much better off having dedicated tanks and dedicated supports as well. Some raiders call this the golden age of Guild Wars 2, while lots of non-raiders call this one of the biggest content droughts the game has ever seen. In the summer of 2016, it was finally time for Living Worlds Season 3. ArenaNet once again tweaked their Living Worlds formula. Episodes would now release with 2 to 3 months intervals instead of the previous 2 weeks. While the wait between episodes was now much longer, episodes became much more meaty. Each episode now added a new map and had much more story content than the episodes in Season 2. Season 3 was received very well, and most players preferred the new format. Sometimes an episode would also include a new legendary, race or fractal. In my opinion, Season 3 was a pretty great time to be a Guild Wars 2 fan. During Season 3, ArenaNet also openly talked about a second expansion being in development. The playerbase was speculating a ton about this new expansion, and after Heart of Thorns, expectations were very high. Unfortunately, several months before the expansion was revealed, a massive leak appeared on the internet, spoiling much of the features and content of the new expansion. The community was honestly pretty good about this. The leak wasn't spread around too much, and most players that had seen the leak were careful not to spoil others. Shortly after the end of Season 3, the next expansion was officially revealed. Path of Fire would take place in the Crystal Desert and Ilona, featuring bigger maps than we had ever seen before. There were also new elite specializations, but the biggest feature of Path of Fire by far were mounts. The player base had always been very skeptical about mounts being added to Guild Wars 2, but they were received very well. Mounts in Guild Wars 2 aren't just a speed boost. The mounts give you brand new methods of traversal, like the Springer that can jump really high. Mounts added a whole new dimension to exploration, and Path of Fire's maps were very much designed with them in mind. Path of Fire had a very short marketing cycle. It came out only 2 months after its reveal. This time there was no content drought at all. But because of this shorter marketing cycle, it also felt that there was maybe a little bit less hype around its release. Mounts were definitely the big feature of Path of Fire. Besides mounts and elite specs, Path of Fire didn't really add too many new features. It mostly built upon the formula which was established by Heart of Thorns. The new maps were gorgeous and were very well received initially, but nowadays a lot of players feel like they lack replayability. It feels like most players still spend a lot of time in the Heart of Thorns maps, but not as much time in the Path of Fire ones. One of my favorite things about Path of Fire was the secret hidden Griffin mount. After finishing the game's story and unlocking all the mounts that had been advertised, it turned out there was actually another secret mount players could go for. Players would have to complete many steps and pay a bunch of gold before they could unlock the secret Griffin. Rumors about this hidden mount were spreading around the player base, and me and my friends had a blast trying to figure out how to unlock it exactly. Amazingly, Path of Fire was not followed by a content drought like Heart of Thorns was. Season 4 kicked off only a couple of months after Path of Fire's release, and the story continued where it had left off. New maps, raids and fractals were added, and in my opinion, the storytelling reached entirely new heights in Season 4. New mounts were added as well. There was the super fast, hard to control roller beetle, and also the free flying sky skill. There was not much gold required to unlock the sky skill, but to get it, players had to complete a long, time-gated collection. This was not received very well by the community. Many players were excited to get their sky skill on release day, but were met with time gates which were almost a week in total. I personally actually kind of enjoyed it. Despite me not liking having to wait around, I kind of enjoyed having something to do every single day. ArenaNet eventually responded to the criticism by reducing the time gates massively, but to this day there are still many players who do not like the sky skill collection. Unfortunately, Season 4 was also the season in which disaster struck ArenaNet. The studio was hit by large layoffs and many employees lost their jobs. After the layoffs, the player base was of course very concerned about the future of Guild Wars 2. Negativity reached an all-time high a couple of months later when ArenaNet announced the next season of the Living Worlds. The Icebrood Saga was announced with a real-life event at the Moore Theater in Seattle. It's not that the Icebrood Saga looks bad, but most players were hoping for something more. Maybe an expansion tease or new exciting endgame content. Icebrood Saga just sounded like more Living Worlds, and it just didn't generate the excitement the community was hoping for. Icebrood Saga's episodes started to come out regularly. These episodes were, in my opinion, not bad at all. The maps were really pretty and filled with lots of stuff to do. I also thought the story was pretty great, with a big focus on the Char and their politics. But Icebrood Saga, despite its quality, was considered by many players to just not be as exciting as a new expansion. Another point of criticism was that Raids and Fractal releases had entirely grinded to a halt. There was only one Fractal released throughout all of the Icebrood Saga, and Raids were not being released anymore at all. Raids had now been replaced by strike missions, which were similar to Raids but significantly easier. They were meant as a stepping stone to Raids, as 10-man content that was more accessible. There were some fun strikes with some actual challenge, but the raiding community criticized most strikes as being way too easy and not very engaging. Then one day, ArenaNet suddenly teased that a new expansion for Guild Wars 2 had entered development. They only showed us a single piece of concept art, but this art seemed to suggest the expansion would take place in Canva, a fondly remembered continent that we had previously seen in Guild Wars 1. This announcement brought back a lot of excitement in the community. Eventually, the name of the expansion was revealed, End of Dragons. And also, it was announced that Guild Wars 2 would be coming to Steam. While the expansion announcement had made many players very excited, the Icebrood Saga was not quite wrapped up yet. The global pandemic affected development, pushing back releases and causing some episodes to initially release without voice acting. The last episode of the Icebrood Saga was not received very well. The ending was split over 3 releases, each adding a set of so-called Dragon Response missions. Many players criticized these as being repetitive and buggy, and the ending of the story honestly felt very rushed. To me, it seems likely that a significant amount of development resources was shifted from the Icebrood Saga to the development of the new expansion. That would explain why the Icebrood Saga's ending felt a bit undercooked. While a large part of the player base has been very vocal with their criticism of the Icebrood Saga, recently it has felt like things have been turning around. The marketing cycle for End of Dragons has ramped up, and many players are very excited to play a new expansion for the first time in over 4 years. During the wait for the expansion, ArenaNet has started adding much requested features to the game, with a very positive response from the community. The Legendary Armory has made legendary items more sought after than before, and it has motivated many players, including myself, to play the game a ton. A beta for DirectX 11 support has been released, significantly increasing the performance of the game. World Restructuring, a feature to make it easier to play World vs World with your guildmates, and to create more balanced matchups, has finally resumed development and has started beta testing. There is no doubt about it, we are currently in a pre-expansion content drought. But despite that fact, it has been a long time since I have been this much into Guild Wars 2. And that brings us to the present. In 2022, Guild Wars 2 will celebrate its 10th anniversary. End of Dragons is on the horizon, and I am incredibly excited for it. So, I'm going to be very positive for a little bit here. I think the new maps look gorgeous, and fishing and skiffs look like a great addition for players that want to socialize. The Siege Turtle feels awesome to control, and the new elite specializations will breathe fresh air into every aspect of the game. There will be lots of new legendary weapons to go for, and there will also be a brand new set of strike missions at launch. Many raiders think that the Icebrood Saga strikes are too easy, but these new strikes will get a special challenge mode briefly after their launch. I really think that strike challenge modes have the potential to be just as good as raid bosses, and that makes my inner raider very happy. I think the future of Guild Wars 2 is very bright. With DirectX 11 and World Restructuring, it feels like ArenaNet is really investing in the future of this game. There are tons of people playing right now, and the expansion and Steam release will only further increase that number. I cannot wait to see what the future holds. And that brings us to the end of my video. I really hope you enjoyed this. This video took a long time to put together. If you enjoy rambling about Guild Wars 2, be sure to stop by my Twitch stream sometime over at twitch.tv/Levalency. I am live 5 days a week, and I would love to see you there. If you want, you can also join my Discord and hang out with some of our awesome community members. The link for the Discord is in the description. See ya!